The day I won the Distinguished Teaching Award at Portland State, surrounded by applauding colleagues, I felt nothing but emptiness. Standing at the podium, my carefully prepared speech felt like ashes in my mouth. I was living what should have been the academic dream, yet somewhere along the way, pure reason had failed me. My name is Denise Lamont, and 6 months ago I was at the pinnacle of secular academic success. As chair of the philosophy department, I had built my career on dismantling religious arguments with surgical precision. My latest book, The Illusion of Transcendence: Deconstructing Religious Experience, was required reading at universities across the country. My husband Connor, a fellow professor in the psychology department, and I lived in a beautiful craftsman home in Portland's West Hills. Our son Philip was thriving at Reed College, following in our intellectual footsteps. By every measurable standard, we had achieved everything we'd worked toward. But late at night, when the house was quiet and my family slept, I would lie awake staring at the ceiling, haunted by questions I couldn't reason away. What was the point of it all? If consciousness was just firing neurons, if morality was merely social construct, if love was only evolutionary programming, then why did everything feel so hollow? The irony wasn't lost on me. I had spent my entire career teaching students to think critically, to question everything, to follow evidence wherever it led. Yet when that same intellectual honesty turned inward, it revealed cracks in the foundation of everything I believed. The first fissure appeared during what should have been a routine faculty meeting. Dr. James Morrison from Religious Studies had proposed adding a world religions requirement to the general education curriculum. The room erupted in polite but pointed objections. As department chair, I was expected to lead the charge against what my colleagues saw as legitimizing superstition. Religion is mythology with delusions of grandeur, I stated confidently, echoing words I'd spoken countless times before. We're here to educate, not indoctrinate students into prescientific thinking. But as I spoke, I caught sight of Morrison's face. Instead of anger or defensiveness, I saw something that unsettled me: pity. Not for himself, but for me. In that moment, I glimpsed my own certainty through his eyes and realized how dogmatic I sounded. The very closed-mindedness I accused religious believers of possessing. That night, I found myself in my office at 2 a.m., surrounded by philosophy texts, trying to shake the uncomfortable feeling that I was missing something crucial. For the first time in years, I pulled out the primary sources: Augustine, Aquinas, Kierkegaard, not to find ammunition for deconstruction, but to genuinely understand what brilliant minds throughout history had found so compelling about faith. Augustine's Confessions sat heavy in my hands. I had dismissed it years ago as the ramblings of a guilt-ridden ancient mind, but reading it now with different eyes, I found philosophical sophistication that rivaled any contemporary work. His analysis of time, memory, and consciousness was breathtaking. How had I missed this? The questions multiplied. If religious belief was merely evolutionary adaptation, why had it produced such profound philosophical insights? If faith was intellectual weakness, how had it motivated some of history's greatest scientific advances? My neat materialist explanations suddenly felt inadequate. I began what I told myself was purely academic research into the philosophical foundations of religious belief. Late nights in my office became explorations into territories I'd never seriously considered: the fine-tuning of cosmic constants, the hard problem of consciousness, the unexplained effectiveness of mathematics in describing reality, the persistent human sense of transcendence that no reductive explanation could fully account for. Each question led to more questions. My certainty, the bedrock of my professional identity, began to erode. The breaking point came during a graduate seminar on the philosophy of mind. Sarah Williamson, one of my most promising doctoral candidates, had written a paper examining the limitations of physicalist explanations for subjective experience. Her argument was rigorous, well-researched, and devastating to the materialist worldview I'd spent decades defending. "Professor Lamont," she said after class, "I've been reading your early work on consciousness, and I'm confused. Your arguments against dualism seem to create more problems than they solve. How do you account for the irreducible nature of first-person experience within a purely physical framework?" I opened my mouth to give my standard response about emergent properties and neural complexity, but the words felt hollow. Sarah's clear brown eyes waited patiently as I struggled with something I'd never experienced before. intellectual honesty, compelling me toward an answer I didn't want to accept. That's an excellent question, Sarah. Perhaps we should explore it further next week. She nodded and gathered her things, but I caught her expression of disappointment. My star student had expected more from me. She'd expected truth, not evasion. That evening, Connor found me in my study, staring at a legal pad covered with half-formed thoughts and crossed-out arguments. "Working late again?" he asked, settling into the chair across from my desk. "You've been distracted lately. Everything okay?" How could I tell him that everything I'd built my career on felt increasingly uncertain, that the woman who'd written 3 books demolishing religious arguments was beginning to question her own demolition? "Just working through some philosophical problems," I said carefully. "Anything I can help with? Fresh perspective from the psychology side?" I almost laughed. Connor's psychological reductionism was even more rigid than my philosophical materialism. To him, religious experience was simply misfiring neurons and childhood conditioning. How could I explain that I was beginning to see the limitations of that view? "It's probably nothing, just some research for a paper I'm considering." But it wasn't nothing. Over the following weeks, my secret exploration deepened. I found myself in the university library's theology section at odd hours, checking out books I'd never imagined reading seriously. C.S. Lewis's Mere Christianity, G.K. Chesterton's Orthodoxy, William Lane Craig's Philosophical Defenses of Theism. Each book I expected to easily refute instead presented arguments I couldn't dismiss. These weren't the straw men I'd been attacking for years. These were sophisticated philosophical positions developed by minds as sharp as any in secular academia. The most disturbing realization was how intellectually dishonest my previous attacks had been. I'd been arguing against caricatures, not the actual strongest forms of religious thought. The same rigorous standards I demanded in secular philosophy, I'd abandon when examining religious claims. My teaching began to reflect this internal struggle. In my philosophy of religion course, instead of the usual systematic deconstruction of theistic arguments, I found myself presenting stronger versions of religious positions. Students noticed the change immediately. "Professor Lamont," asked Jake Martinez after a particularly intense class discussion, "you seem to be arguing both sides now. What do you actually believe?" The question hit like a physical blow. What did I believe? The materialist worldview that had seemed so solid now felt full of holes, but the alternative, that there might actually be something beyond the physical universe, felt impossible to accept after a lifetime of skepticism. "I believe in following the evidence wherever it leads," I said finally, "even when it's uncomfortable." But privately, I was terrified. If my worldview was wrong, what else might I have been wrong about? My marriage was built on shared intellectual principles. My career depended on philosophical positions I was beginning to doubt. My relationship with Philip was grounded in raising him to be a critical thinker who questioned religious claims. If those foundations crumbled, what would be left? The crisis deepened when I received an unexpected email from Dr. Morrison in Religious Studies. He wanted to meet privately to discuss something he called a matter of mutual academic interest. Curiosity overrode caution, and I agreed to meet him at a coffee shop off campus. Morrison arrived looking nervous, glancing around the cafe before settling into the booth across from me. Up close, I noticed something I'd missed in faculty meetings. The man looked exhausted, almost haunted. "Thank you for coming, Denise. What I'm about to tell you could destroy both our careers, but I think you need to hear it." My stomach dropped. "What are you talking about, James?" He leaned forward, lowering his voice. "There's something you should know about the current faculty review process, about why certain professors are being targeted for ideological assessment." The words sent ice through my veins. Targeted for what? The administration has been conducting a quiet investigation into faculty members whose recent work or behavior suggests what they call concerning philosophical drift. Your name came up because of changes colleagues have noticed in your teaching, your questions during faculty meetings, the books you've been checking out from the library. I felt sick. "How do you know this?" "Because I've been feeding them information." His voice cracked. "Denise, I'm so sorry. They approached me months ago after my world religions proposal was shot down. They offered me tenure-track positions for my graduate students, research funding, a promotion to full professor, All I had to do was report on faculty members who might be experiencing religious ideation or philosophical instability. The betrayal hit harder than I expected. "You've been spying on your colleagues?" At first, I told myself I was protecting academic freedom by giving them harmless information. But it escalated. They wanted detailed reports on your research, your student interactions, any signs of what they termed intellectual compromise. "Denise, they're building a case to challenge your fitness for tenure despite your protected status." My hands shook as I gripped my coffee cup. "Why are you telling me this now?" Morrison's eyes filled with tears. "Because I've been wrestling with my own faith for years. I've watched you go through the same journey I've been on, and I realized I couldn't participate in destroying someone for the crime of honest inquiry. What they're doing, what I've been helping them do, it's everything we claim to stand against in academia." The revelation reframed everything. My growing sense of being watched and judged wasn't paranoia, it was reality. The university I'd served faithfully for 15 years was systematically targeting faculty for thought crime. "What exactly have you reported about me?" I asked.
Your library records, the changes in your teaching style, the fact that you've been asking different kinds of questions in seminars. They know about your recent research into religious philosophy. They're interpreting it as evidence of mental instability or religious conversion."
And what if it were conversion? The question slipped out before I could stop it. Morrison stared at me for a long moment. "Denise, are you?" "I don't know what I am anymore, James. The evidence I've been examining doesn't support the conclusions I've spent my career defending, but I'm terrified to follow it to its logical end." What happened next changed everything. Morrison reached across the table and took my hand, a gesture so gentle and unexpected that I almost pulled away. "Denise, I became a Christian 3 years ago. Real faith, not just academic study of religion. I've been living in fear ever since, hiding it from colleagues, compartmentalizing my beliefs to keep my job. When they approached me to spy on others, I was so desperate to protect my secret that I agreed to betray my principles." The words hung in the air like a revelation. Here was a brilliant scholar who'd found what I was searching for, yet lived in the same fear that was consuming me. "How?" I whispered. "How did you know it was real?" "The same way you'll know," he said softly, "when you stop running from the truth and let yourself encounter it directly. Denise, all this philosophical investigation is preparation, but at some point you have to move from your head to your heart." That night, I couldn't sleep. Morrison's confession had shattered my last illusions about academic objectivity and intellectual freedom. But more than that, his personal testimony had opened a door I'd been afraid to walk through. I found myself in my study at 3 a.m., surrounded by books that now felt like signposts pointing toward something I'd spent my life denying. The philosophical arguments had done their work. They'd demolished my confidence in materialism and opened space for transcendence. But what came next? For the first time in my adult life, I did something that felt both terrifying and completely natural. I spoke to the silence as if someone was listening. "I don't know how to do this," I said aloud, feeling foolish but continuing anyway. "I don't know how to pray, or what to believe, or if any of this is real. But if you're there, if you're who these books claim you are, I need to know. Whatever it costs me." Nothing dramatic happened. No vision, no audible voice, no mystical experience, just a profound sense of peace settling over me like a warm blanket. For the first time in months, the questions that had been tormenting me seemed less important than the presence I felt in that small room. I woke up the next morning with my head on my desk, sunlight streaming through the windows. The books around me seemed different somehow, not abstract philosophical texts but invitations to relationship. The fear that had dominated my thoughts for weeks was still there, but it was no longer in control. The real test came that afternoon. Connor was waiting for me when I got home from campus, his expression carefully neutral in a way that meant serious conversation. "Denise, we need to talk." My heart sank. "About what?" "About whatever's been going on with you these past few months. The late nights, the distraction, the changes in your teaching. Philip called me. He's worried about you. He says you sounded different during your last conversation, like you were questioning things you've always been certain about." I sat down across from him, knowing this moment would define everything that came next. "Connor, what if we've been wrong? What if the materialist worldview we've built our lives on isn't adequate to explain reality? His face went pale. Denise, what are you saying? I'm saying that honest intellectual inquiry has led me to conclusions I never expected. The evidence for design in the universe, the fine-tuning of physical constants, the hard problem of consciousness, the inadequacy of evolutionary explanations for morality and meaning. Connor, the philosophical case for theism is stronger than we've admitted. You're scaring me, he said quietly. This sounds like religious conversion, not philosophical investigation. The words hung between us like an accusation. In our academic circles, religious conversion was the ultimate intellectual failure, evidence of weakness, delusion, or mental breakdown. What if it's both? I asked. What if honest philosophy can lead to genuine faith? Connor stood up abruptly, pacing to the window. Denise, think about what you're saying. Think about your career, your reputation, our family. You can't seriously be considering abandoning everything we've worked for based on some emotional crisis. It's not emotional crisis, it's intellectual honesty. Connor, I've been studying the strongest forms of religious argument, not the straw men we usually attack. The case is more compelling than we've acknowledged. You're having a breakdown, he said flatly. This is what religious delusion looks like in intelligent people. First doubt, then rationalization, then full conversion. I've seen it before. His words stung because part of me feared he was right. How could I trust my own judgment when it was leading me toward conclusions that contradicted everything I'd believed? But then I remembered Morrison's words, when you stop running from the truth and let yourself encounter it directly. I thought about the peace I'd felt the night before, the sense of presence that no materialist explanation could account for. Connor, what if we're the ones who've been deluding ourselves? What if we've been so committed to naturalism that we've closed ourselves off to evidence that points beyond it? Evidence? He laughed harshly. What evidence? Philosophical arguments aren't evidence. They're sophisticated speculation. You're talking about believing in something there's no empirical proof for. Like consciousness, I countered, like the reliability of reason itself, like the existence of objective moral truths. Connor, our entire worldview depends on things we can't prove empirically. The argument continued for hours, growing more heated as we circled around fundamental questions neither of us could definitively answer. By the end, we were both exhausted and further apart than ever. I need time to think, Connor said finally. This conversation, Denise, I don't know who you are anymore. I'm the same person who's always followed evidence wherever it leads. The only difference is where the evidence is pointing now. He left that night to stay with his brother, taking clothes for several days. The house felt empty without him, but also strangely peaceful. For the first time in our marriage, I didn't have to pretend to be certain about things I was questioning. The next morning brought an email that confirmed my worst fears about the university investigation. I was being called in for a wellness check with the faculty assistance program, ostensibly to ensure I was handling work-related stress appropriately. The language was careful and professional, but the message was clear. My fitness for my position was being questioned. I spent the weekend reading more deeply in Christian philosophy and theology, no longer pretending it was purely academic research. The works of Alvin Plantinga, Richard Swinburne, and Edward Fesser provided sophisticated philosophical frameworks for theistic belief. More importantly, they offered intellectual respectability for the journey my heart was already taking. By Sunday evening, I knew I was standing at a crossroads. I could retreat back to safe materialism, repair my marriage, preserve my career, and continue living with the growing sense of emptiness that had started this whole journey. Or I could continue following the evidence toward conclusions that would cost me everything, but might offer something more valuable in return. The decision crystallized as I sat in my study, surrounded by books that had become windows into a reality larger than anything I'd previously imagined. If this was truth, if God was real, if Jesus was who the Gospels claimed he was, if the materialist worldview was ultimately inadequate, then no cost was too high to pay for it. I knelt beside my desk, feeling awkward but determined. The words came haltingly at first, then with growing confidence. Jesus, if you're real, if everything I've been learning about you is true, then I want to know you, not just intellectually, but personally. I'm willing to lose everything else if that's what it takes. Help me to trust you with the consequences. The transformation wasn't instantaneous or magical, but it was real. Over the following days, I found myself talking to God throughout the day, reading scripture not as historical artifact but as personal communication, experiencing a relationship that was more real than any philosophical concept I'd ever studied. The cost came quickly. Connor returned home with an ultimatum: abandon this religious phase or face divorce proceedings. When I couldn't promise to return to our shared atheism, he moved out permanently. Philip, caught between his parents, struggled to understand how his rational mother could embrace something he'd been taught to dismiss as superstition. The university investigation intensified. Colleagues who'd respected my work for years now questioned my judgment openly. Research funding became mysteriously unavailable. Speaking invitations dried up. The academic community I'd called home for decades began treating me like a contagious disease. But something unexpected happened alongside the losses. Morrison introduced me to a small group of Christian faculty who met quietly to support each other in an increasingly hostile environment. Through them, I discovered I wasn't alone. There were believers throughout the university, hidden but faithful, carrying on their work with quiet integrity. Dr. Patricia Williams from the English department became a mentor, helping me navigate the relationship between faith and scholarship. Dr. Michael Chang from chemistry showed me how his scientific research had actually strengthened his belief in God. These weren't the intellectually weak believers of my previous stereotypes. They were rigorous scholars who'd found their faith through, not despite, their academic work. The formal review of my tenure came 3 months after my conversion. The hearing was a carefully orchestrated attack on my fitness for academic work, disguised as concern for my well-being. Colleagues testified about changes in my teaching, my research interests, my apparent instability. The fact that my conversion was never mentioned explicitly made the proceeding even more sinister. They were punishing me for thought crime while maintaining plausible deniability. I was given the option to take early retirement with reduced benefits or face formal dismissal proceedings. The message was clear. There was no place for authentic Christian belief in their vision of academic freedom. That night, I cleaned out my office, packing away 15 years of academic achievement. The books that had led me to faith went into one box, labeled essential. The rest, awards, publications, mementos of a career built on certainty I no longer possessed, went into storage. As I took one last look at the office that had been my second home, I felt sadness but not regret. The woman who'd first questioned her materialist assumptions in this room had found something worth losing everything for. The academic who'd built her identity on intellectual superiority had discovered humility and faith were more valuable than professional acclaim. Walking across campus for the last time as a faculty member, I passed students hurrying to classes, professors heading to meetings, administrators managing the complex machinery of higher education. This world that had seemed so important now felt strangely small and fragile. There were bigger truths than could be contained in any university, larger purposes than any academic career could fulfill. Connor filed for divorce 2 weeks later, citing irreconcilable differences. Philip chose to live with his father, unable to understand how his mother could abandon reason for faith. Friends from our social and professional circles gradually stopped calling. The comfortable life we'd built together dissolved like sand through my fingers. But as each familiar support disappeared, something stronger took its place. The small community of Christian believers became family in ways my blood relatives had never been. Prayer became as natural as breathing. Scripture spoke to my heart with authority no philosophical text had ever possessed. The relationship with Jesus that had begun as intellectual investigation became the most real thing in my life. I found work as an adjunct instructor at Portland Community College, teaching introductory philosophy. The students were different, working adults, single mothers, immigrants seeking education. Many had never considered philosophical questions before. Teaching them felt more significant than any graduate seminar I'd ever led. One evening, as I prepared for a class on ethics, I found myself thinking about the journey that had brought me here. The prestigious position was gone, the comfortable income vanished, the respected reputation destroyed. But the peace that had eluded me despite all my worldly success now filled my days. The questions that had tormented me for years had been answered, not through philosophical proof but through personal encounter with the one who is truth itself. A knock at my apartment door interrupted my thoughts. I opened it to find Sarah Williamson, my former doctoral student, standing in the hallway with tears in her eyes. Professor Lamont. I'm sorry, Dr. Lamont. I heard what happened. I've been doing my own reading since you left, following up on the questions we discussed in class. I think I'm starting to understand what you found. I invited her in, making tea while she told me about her own journey of questioning. Her brilliant mind was wrestling with the same evidence that had transformed my life, leading her toward the same conclusions I'd discovered. I'm scared, she admitted. If I follow this where it's leading, I'll lose my fellowship, probably my chance at an academic career, but I can't unknow what I'm learning. I sat across from her, seeing my younger self in her struggle. Sarah, I won't lie to you. The cost is real. I've lost almost everything I thought mattered, but what I've gained is worth infinitely more. How can you be sure? The question that had tormented me for months now had a simple answer. Because I'm not the same person I was when this journey started. The emptiness is gone. The questions that kept me awake at night have been answered. I've found what I didn't even know I was looking for. We talked until late into the night, sharing the fears and hopes that come with following truth beyond the boundaries of acceptable academic thought. As Sarah prepared to leave, she asked one final question. What would you say to someone who's afraid to take the next step? I thought of my own moment of decision, kneeling in my study, surrounded by books that had become bridges to faith. I'd say that Jesus is worth everything you'll lose, and more valuable than anything you can imagine gaining. The truth isn't always comfortable, but it's always worth pursuing. After she left, I returned to my class preparation, but my heart was full of gratitude. The professor Denise Lamont, who'd won teaching awards and published prestigious books, had died the day I knelt in my study and surrendered to truth. The woman who'd risen in her place was someone I was still getting to know, humbler, more dependent, infinitely more at peace. Tomorrow, I would stand before a classroom of community college students, teaching them to think clearly about life's biggest questions. I would tell them what I'd learned, that honest inquiry, fearlessly pursued, can lead to truths larger than any academic system can contain. Some might follow that inquiry to its ultimate conclusion, as I had, others might not. But all would be invited to consider that reality might be more wonderful and mysterious than they'd ever dared imagine. The cost of following Jesus had been everything I'd thought I valued. The reward was everything I'd actually been searching for all along. In losing my life, I'd found life itself, and for the first time since I could remember, that was enough.